things can start small. You can try ideas, you can engage communities, and then, good ideas can multiply. And Parking Day has multiplied. Today, it's now an international phenomenon. And during the pandemic, we've seen these kinds of experiments explode. There's the city run program that was inspired by that day called the Parklet program. And there were only about 76 parklets before the pandemic. But today there's well over 2,000 shared space applications across the city. And so in writing from the ground up, I saw these examples throughout the country and people testing ideas from city streets to our shorelines. And I found many of these stories really hopeful, especially in light of climate change, where there's a greater urgency than ever.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real estate. I'm Neil Collins, and on the show today we have designer Alison Sant to talk about unique ways that people at the front line of climate change are helping to create resilient, equitable, and livable cities across the U.S. When you turn on the news today, it's hard not to feel rattled by the doom and gloom that is peddled by the large media corporations, no matter what political affiliation you have. Climate change, mass shootings, species extinction, political insurrections, war, inflation, all of it can sit heavy on our emotional well-being. Hollywood is not much different either, where more and more movies are set in post-apocalyptic times and portray dystopian futures. Research shows that people don't respond well to this kind of doom and gloom. It's disenfranchising, and it makes us want to retreat. Yes, alarming things are happening in the world, and I'm not advocating complete abstinence from the media, but I do think it is absolutely critical to have a different kind of story be told. That's why I'm excited to share this conversation I had with Alison Sant recently about her search to find stories about how people most affected by climate change are responding with action and are looking to incorporate community, nature, and equity as the driving solutions. Alison is a founding partner of Studio for Urban Projects and has an incredibly fascinating background that we get into. Part activist, designer, and artist, she is an example of someone that is helping to turn the needle of culture with projects that aim to bring sustainability and equity into the design of cities. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. It is a pleasure to be joined by Alison Sant. Alison, I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time now because we're playing a game of who's getting sick and who's not sick, and finally we're able to record this. But thank you for taking the time to sit down. This is going to be a lot of fun.
And thank you so much for having me, Neil. I'm very excited to be here.
Alison, let's turn the clock back. And I'm really curious where you grew up and how you grew up, because I think that really helps people understand the context and what you're coming from.
Sure. Yeah. So it's interesting because I was sort of mining my own history a bit as I was writing the foreword to my book, because I was looking at my own history against so many of the things that I was investigating. And, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I was born the day before the first Earth Day in 1970. So, and this is, the same year as the Clean Air Act was signed into legislation, and just 2 years before the Clean Water Act. Policies that continue to inform city design today and very much informed the research I did. So yeah, my parents actually moved from California, where I live now, and they were drawn to participate in the environmental movement that was really shaping the country, but especially shaping politics in DC at that time and gaining momentum there, both in government and also in nonprofits. So I'd say that, kind of learning about the world through their eyes, and certainly the exposure to the people that influence them, has certainly, shaped my own commitment to addressing climate change, especially as I became a parent myself and also went into my own practice.
What did that look like growing up for you? What do you think some of those influences that came via your parents? Was it through excursions, through the type of pedagogy in the school that they put you in, or what was it really, especially at that critical time of the 70s where there's a lot of counterculture and consciousness that is starting to rise, but certainly a lot of political tensions going on then as well?
Right. Yeah. So this is, the age of the energy crisis and a real sensibility around limits to using fossil fuels. At the time, we wanted to be more independent in terms of our energy sources, but there's also a lot of other things going on. My mom was deeply involved in, at the time, the word was population, but I think has really turned into access to birth control and decisions around pregnancies. And my father was more involved in conservation, and their friends were people like Dana Meadows, who wrote Limits to Growth, who, was modeling kind of the limits of the globe, of our Earth, and people like Amory Lovins, who were looking at energy and things like that. But I also have to say that because I grew up in the district, it wasn't just the ideas and their, ideas that were shaping me. It was also kind of this very vivid experience of the wall of racial segregation as well in a city like DC, which is so divided. And, I experienced that in various ways in my life, because I feel like that kind of first impression of racial segregation and the way in which it splits neighborhoods and divides American cities was so poignant. The district at the time was, there was like a person a day killed in the district, and it was called the murder capital of the United States, while I was a teenager. And I became aware that even though these statistics were certainly making their way to the headlines on the newspapers in my house, the reality of them didn't affect our family the way it did our neighbors living on the east side of the city. And when I moved to college later in New York City and was a documentary photography student in like the late 80s, early 90s, it was another era of enormous crime and violence. And I can say too that, although crime affected my life and certainly those of my friends, living in Greenwich Village was undoubtedly a much different experience than living in Harlem at the time, where I taught photography to kids in public housing. And then again, the experience of moving to San Francisco during my professional life. This city has been going through decades of an increasing wealth gap. And today, the realities of the pandemic have really laid that bare. There's a massive, racial and economic disparity between Americans that have been measured in death rates and incidents of police brutality and job losses. So, I think through all of these experiences, I've become really aware that my privilege as a white, educated woman can really shield me from understanding what it's like to grow up in parts of the city that have experienced redlining and environmental injustice and chronic disinvestment. And so, in my work, I've tried to use my privilege to really expose these inequalities and amplify the stories of the people working to create a more equal society.
Well, let's go back to the documentary photojournalism in your undergrad. What really directed you into that field?
I was, again, sort of interested in interrogating this division that I found, which is what's the difference between the way I'm growing up and the way other people are experiencing life, and wanting to use the camera as a way of breaking into people's lives and gaining their trust and talking with them. And, so much of what I did in researching my book was the same thing. I ended up interviewing over 90 people and talking to them about their experiences. And it's just, I have to say, it's a wonderful way to learn. And it's exactly what drew me to documentary photography, and this is a different time. This is, the late 80s when digital photography was just barely coming into view. And documentary still had a hold on people's sense of, what was war like? What was it like to grow up in a different neighborhood? It's like all of those things were exposed through pictures and photographs in a way then that I still relate to now. And obviously nothing is objective, but they do give us these windows into people's lives. And I've continued on in trying to do that in other ways in my life, not just thinking about the medium being important, but thinking about the impulse to do it as the thing that drives me.
When did architecture and design enter into the picture?
Yeah, so that came up in my graduate work. I worked as an artist for years. I took about 10 years between my undergraduate and my graduate work. And I went back to school at the College of Environmental Design at UC Berkeley. And there they had this really interesting program, which was called Visual Studies, where I could pull from urban planning and landscape architecture and architecture, as well as the rest of the university, which included, information management systems and, kind of this really, really wide variety, sociology, politics. And so I just used the university to kind of explore my interests. And, eventually came out of that. And my partner and I started an urban design firm called the Studio for Urban Projects in the early 2000s, which, was a time in San Francisco where the city was really being shaped by urban experiments. And, many of us felt that by creating temporary interventions, we didn't have to wait for top-down planning efforts to make improvements to our public spaces. We could create spaces for biking with chalk paint and pop-up playgrounds and empty plazas and parks and parking spots. And that these prototypes could really shape the public imagination for what the city could become. And I not only participated in these projects as a designer and as an activist, I also participated in them as a mother. And I can share a story with you that sort of crystallized a lot of those ideas in my work. At the time, early 2000s, we were living and working in a warehouse in South of Market, which was functioning as our design office and our home, and it housed our wood and metal shop. And it was a great place for us to kind of trade off parenting and work. But the only problem was that Soma was just, that neighborhood was just surrounded by fast moving cars and highway on-ramps. So taking a child for a walk was really challenging there. To give you a sense, putting a stroller out near the curb felt like, risking their lives, and certainly allowing them to ride their bikes on the street was death-defying. For those of your audience that may have experienced video games in the 1980s, it felt to me like, a real world version of Frogger. It was just terrible. But nonetheless, I can make light of it now that my kids are grown up. But at the time, during one of the first parking day experiments in 2007, which you may know of, which it was started in San Francisco by some friends of ours and a great group called Rebar. And they were an art and design collective that tried to open source the idea of making parks and parking spots. And so I took my 2-year-old son at the time for a tour of them, and they were all over the city. You pay the meter and set up something, and people had created golf courses and yoga studios and libraries, and, just saw it and a nice place to sit. So our first stop was up at our local grocery store, where Garden for the Environment, which is a local Bay Area nonprofit, had created this beautiful demonstration garden, and they were teaching composting and urban farming. And Blair Randall, who was working there at the time, put a big pile of earth in my son's hand, and out of it came this worm. It just sort of wriggled to the top. And he was just clearly delighted. His giggles were infectious, and I loved it. And I felt that, it was remarkable that just in 140 square feet of space on the corner of this really busy intersection on Howard and 8th, that he was having an experience of nature. And I was having an experience of what it would be like to use our public right-of-ways for more than just moving and storing cars. And this experience really helped me to understand that things can start small. You can try ideas, you can engage communities, and then, good ideas can multiply. And Parking Day has multiplied. Today, it's now an international phenomenon. And during the pandemic, we've seen these kinds of experiments explode. There's the city-run program that was inspired by that day called the Parklet program. And there were only about 76 parklets before the pandemic. But today, there's well over 2,000 shared space applications across the city. And so in writing from the ground up, I saw these examples throughout the country. And people testing ideas from city streets to our shorelines. And I found many of these stories really hopeful, especially in light of climate change, where there's a greater urgency than ever to find solutions. So I can say that as a mom, I've become dedicated to looking out not only for my kids, but all of our kids, and doing my best to make work in cities more humane, equitable, and resilient while addressing global climate change.
Before we get back into the episode, I want to share something incredibly exciting with you. For the first time ever, there's going to be a regenerative real estate gathering at the end of the summer at the one and only Riverbend Farm in Saco, Maine. Now, I'd call it a conference, but that would definitely be doing it injustice, as the gathering at the world-famous Riverbend Farm will be like no other conference you have attended. This place may sound familiar to you if you tuned into the episode I did with Drew Dumpsch in June of 2021. You see, Drew is the founder and the executive director of the Ecology School, which is housed at the bucolic 105-acre working Riverbend Farm. Not only will we enjoy the company of incredible visionaries and professionals, but the environment itself will blow you away. You see, the farm was designed as one of the world's first Living Community Challenge projects that is put out by the International Living Future Institute. This rigorous building certification goes beyond the Living Building Challenge and is the perfect setting to not just talk about how we can transform the real estate industry, but what it looks like, tastes like, and feels like in real life. So join us August 24th through the 27th and get to know the people behind this regenerative movement. These are the professionals that are part of the transformation of the way we inhabit this planet. They are designers and developers, consultants and lenders, and the ones that are shaping the future of how we design, build, transact, and steward land and place. During this time, you'll learn firsthand about the world's most innovative real estate projects, such as living buildings and living communities. You'll be able to swap strategies and get insights about funding sources that are looking to spur regenerative real estate projects. You'll be able to connect with regenerative practitioners that are revolutionizing the real estate industry by demonstrating that real estate can be used as a force for good. This is the time that we need leaders and co-creators like yourself, now more than ever. This is not an event that you're going to want to miss, and it'll be such a small investment that has truly a lifetime of value. You can learn more by visiting Latitude's journal at chooselatitude.com/journal to search for the event. I hope to see you there.
There's a lot to pick up there. And I think the first place that I want to go is really understanding you're new into your career. This like interplay between activism and architecture and urban planning. I know a lot of people get paralyzed in that sense of, I want to do these kinds of experiments and I want to express myself. And there can be a lot of creativity that starts to burst from the seams, but then it's almost like the business side comes in and says, you need to focus on revenue generating activities. And how did you go about finding the balance of that, of really demonstrating or creating more demonstrations of using public space in right ways, but then building your career and building a business?
Right. Well, we've been very lucky in the sense that we've been able to work with organizations like Yerba Buena Center for the Arts and the city planning department, which has been able to put money towards creating these kinds of experiments. So, for example, we did a piece on Market Street called The Outpost, and it was essentially like a living room outside. It was made out of, really cheap materials, but it was a modular system that we could put up and take down and change and look at how we could engage the public in a dialogue around the future of that street, but also to do it in a way that could serve the people of that neighborhood and allow it to be programmed by a variety of folks, not just us and our ideas as architects and urban designers, which I think is often the failure of our profession, is that in many ways we need to take direction from communities themselves, not overwhelm them with, but here are our plans and our thoughts and our designs. And so in our work, we've really tried to do that. We've tried to work with partners that understand that and are eager for that. And we've found this niche of working at the kind of pavilion scale, at the prototyping scale, and kept our practice really small so that we aren't supporting a huge staff. We're bringing people in with the kinds of projects that we are able to do, and then moving on to the next piece. So some of the ideas that were part of the Outpost, years ago on Market Street are still a part of a project we're working on right now to restore oysters in the bay. And these modular oyster reefs are creating buffers to storm surge, but they're using the kind of same design ideas, cheap materials put together in a modular way. In this case, we've been able to teach other people how to use the system and create the system so that it's actually part of a jobs training program as well for folks in San Rafael, which is one of the lowest lying communities around the bay. So they're participating and economically participating in the development coming to their urban waters. So that's been for us a kind of unique niche is to try and carve out the space where we can stay small and lean and develop things at a scale where we can really be inventive.
And I hope this gives people a good sense that I don't think the word architecture does it justice of what you're talking about. I mean, really bringing in urban ecology and participatory design and deep listening. And that's what personally gets me really excited is how do we redesign the process? And I've always gravitated towards urban planning, and in a very traditional sense, it's bureaucratic, it's cumbersome, it's archaic, and it's quite frustrating. But there's this other way that's starting to form that is just really hopeful. And the creativity that it's taken to get there is so fascinating. And that's where I think we can pick up from the ground up local efforts to create resilient cities. Your new book, I'm curious, what gave you the inspiration to sit down, put pen to paper? And I think even before putting pen to paper, an extraordinary amount of research needed to go into this. But what was that initial spark for you, Alison?
Really, the spark of this has come out of my exposure as an urban designer and an activist to the science of climate change, right? And both the ways in which people are inventing, how they're addressing it, but also just the real statistics around it. It can be, this from your own children, and I have children as well. It can be overwhelming and terrifying, as I think we all realize that the choices that we make today will have profound effects on the future. Climate change is urgent. We have less than 8 years to have carbon emissions and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this is just to avoid the worst of its effects. But many of us have experienced them already. In California, we have wildfires and extreme heat events and severe storms and flooding. Certainly, I cover that in New York and New Orleans especially. But I really, really feel through my work and through the work that I've seen around the country that cities are the place to act. And cities are responsible for 75% of global carbon emissions. And they're the places where the majority of us live as the world's population has tipped to urban. So the way we live in cities matters. And I wrote from the ground up because I wanted to understand the ways in which cities are mitigating and adapting to climate change. And what was amazing to me is I found out that they're doing much more. So people are finding not only ways, effective ways to make cities more resilient, but they're creating more equitable and livable communities in the process of doing that. So the book breaks down sort of into 4 calls to action. The first is to reclaim the streets, because when streets are free from cars, we can create safe places to walk and bike and more efficient public transit for everyone. We lower carbon emissions and create greater equity. It also provides a space to do other things. We were talking about parking day earlier, but when you do things that go as far as tearing up the concrete, which is sort of action 2, we can create green streets and rain gardens, floodable parks that slow stormwater and prevent extreme floods while making the places that we live more lush and alive. We can plant cities with street trees and expand our urban tree canopy in order to sequester carbon, mitigate air pollution, and cool our streets. And then, finally, we can adapt our shorelines by restoring wetlands or installing oyster reefs, as we've been talking about, and other nature-based solutions. We can buffer future storms and protect frontline communities. So, as From the Ground Up describes, this work is already underway in cities across the country. For me, it's been so much fun to find out more about it, because I think when you're terrified and confronting terrifying statistics, it's great to find that there's so much energy in the grassroots going on to change that.
Yeah, one thing that really hit me about this book is that I'm from Louisiana, and one of the examples is so heartfelt for me in that I had a very similar upbringing, in that there was a dividing line in town, that this is the predominantly Black area and this is the predominantly white area. And growing up in this time, my life has been defined by climate change, from hurricanes to Katrina. I even went to graduate school whenever Hurricane Sandy came through, and that affected us in Vermont, of all places. And then to be on the West Coast and to experience these wildfires. But Louisiana, even though I don't live there, it's like deeply rooted in my mind, just of the unsurmountable challenge it feels like. But you describe a story in there that is really seeped in the best elements that Louisianians exhibit around a kitchen table and storytelling and small actions that does ripple out. I'd love for you to share that one, because that certainly put an imprint on me and really made me reminiscent of my childhood.
Absolutely. So yeah, I love that story too. And I'll back up and give a little context to this, because I think you bring up a really important point, which is, it's striking how much systemic racism is a part of how we encounter climate change. And when I began writing this book, I understood the ways in which our historical ecology affects how cities and neighborhoods fare in extreme weather. Predictably, it floods in areas that were once wetlands or stream beds or marshes. But what became more vivid to me as I researched this book was how people are impacted in extreme weather is equally shaped by the history of systemic racism in this country. And due to discriminatory policies like redlining and restrictive covenants, race is too often correlated with where people live in cities and what elevation they live at and what temperatures they're exposed to and what resources they have in times of emergency. So as a result, climate change disproportionately affects under-resourced communities and communities of color. So for example, as you bring up in New Orleans, as the city grew, discriminatory development policies condensed its Black population in the lower elevations of the city. And this had devastating effects during Hurricane Katrina, when New Orleans' Black population made up 76% of its flood victims. And the story also played out in other examples in like Baltimore, where there can be as much as 50% tree canopy cover in affluent parts of the city, and East Baltimore's redline neighborhoods as little as 6%. So it's critical that we address these gross disparities as we find solutions to climate change. And what's really interesting is that what I found is in places like New Orleans, there have been incredible community leaders that have spearheaded solutions to climate change. So after Hurricane Katrina, Angela Chalk, who is the executive director of Healthy Community Services in the 7th Ward, a neighborhood hit very hard in the hurricane. She was one of the first people to move back to her neighborhood, and she worked with Waterwise Gulf South, which is a citywide nonprofit, and helped to direct investments to her own neighborhood. So she turned out, volunteers to help her make her own yard a green infrastructure demonstration project with bioswales and rain barrels. And when the next storm hit and she didn't flood, her neighbors wanted the same kinds of remedies. And so, knowing her neighbors and her neighborhood, she was able to bring people together to learn about how green infrastructure works and how it complements the really complex network of levees, pumps, and canals throughout the city. So now the 7th Ward has entire blocks of demonstration projects. And it's also part of a network of Waterwise Champions, which is a training program which makes the people in neighborhoods hit the hardest by flooding the experts in green infrastructure solutions. And so as Angela described in our interview, she said everybody's a green infrastructure specialist now in her neighborhood. So in New Orleans, these kinds of community-led approaches are being expanded upon as plans to create an entire resilience district is underway. It's called the Gentilly Resilience District. And, through this example and other examples in the book, I learned that if these kinds of efforts were imposed on communities, they would likely have been met with resistance, whether you're talking about green infrastructure or bike lanes or parks. But when residents are involved in generating the solutions, they can make investments in their neighborhoods relevant to their needs. And so the solutions can be more effective. So New Orleans is just one example in the book in which I argue that people should be leading resilience efforts in their communities.
And it's such a good point. I mean, I even think that well-intentioned programs, they don't travel as fast, or if at all, from citizens that are engaged, that can inform that effort, that can hold these conversations at the kitchen table or out in front of the street, where it's a natural connection point for spontaneous interaction with neighbors to talk about what they want to see and what resources are available. Well, Alison, what are some of the really, maybe your favorite example that comes to mind, or just, I don't want to use the word hopeful, but I guess one of the examples that really stands out in your book, because you talk to so many different people all across the US of climate change resilience in action. What really stands out for you?
I think many of the most interesting case studies in the book are really projects that advanced holistic solutions to the challenges we face, addressing more than one thing at a time. And one of the best examples in the book for me, and certainly one that I loved learning more about, was called the Baltimore Wood Project. And to give some context, as I mentioned before, there's a real disparity in tree canopy cover across Baltimore. And, Baltimore has suffered some of the most severe effects of redlining and restrictive covenants, all those kinds of racial policies that disadvantage some communities. And so that in Baltimore, that has left 30,000 properties counted in 2018 that were either vacant lots or buildings. And at the same time, there's parts of the city with as much as 25% unemployment. So the Baltimore Wood Project employs people with barriers to employment, many who have been informally incarcerated, in deconstructing 4,000 of the city's abandoned buildings and salvaging wood from them. And it's a collaboration including the U.S. Forest Service, the nonprofit Humanum, and the city of Baltimore. And it's interesting. The U.S. Forest Service was interested in creating this project because in the United States, remarkably, there is more wood material going into landfills than is harvested from the national forests. So, and as it decays, that wood releases carbon that it would otherwise store. So now this wood that is, and some of it is species of wood that, you can no longer harvest from forests. It's extraordinary. And this wood is being taken and sold to businesses like Room and Board, who has a line of furniture named after the streets where it came from, like the McKean storage cabinet and the Edding bookcase. And it's also an amazing contribution to the neighborhoods because the lots where these houses once stood are now being converted into parks and small urban forests that can sequester carbon and clean the air and cool those neighborhoods, which contribute to the city's 40% tree canopy goal. And developments like the Eager Street Commons, which I cover in the book, are engaging long-term residents in the development of their neighborhood and providing employment opportunities and avenues to home ownership so that their personal wealth can grow in pace with the neighborhood as investments are made there instead of displacing them. So it's undeniable that Baltimore deserves more resources to meet its ambitious goals. But even without them, they're providing great examples of how social justice and climate action can be integrated.
Yeah, whenever I read that more wood is going into landfill than is getting harvested from our forests, it hit me in the bottom of my stomach of like, oh my goodness. Because I also live in an area, part of the country that I see a lot of the clear cutting that goes on. And it's just unbelievable, the destruction. And so to think, wow, all this lumber is coming out of these living forests that are now just desecrated. We're throwing this away, more than this away every single year. It just was crazy to think and to hear that statistic. One of the interesting conversations that I have on a regular basis, Alison, is around the term regenerative real estate and the name of this podcast. And I think a lot of people at first blush, they think real estate, okay, a house, regenerative. So what do? You put solar panels on houses. And there's a lot of talk at the federal level about, Clean Energy Act and how do we incentivize energy generation, energy efficiency, and it's going to create all these jobs. And this is just the panacea for going forward, is that solar panels and electric vehicles are going to save everything. What do you say to that? I think your book is a testament of what you say to that, but there are so many myriad and holistic ways to go about this that I don't know. I'd love your thoughts on just everything that's happening rather than the silver bullet.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, there are silver bullets. And I think that's why I'm so drawn to the holistic responses to this, is that we need to keep so many things in mind. And when people talk about electric cars being the silver bullet, the thing that it overlooks is that cars still kill people. And they kill a lot of people in cities, mostly people that take public transit or walk and can't afford cars. So it's part of the ecology of massive discrepancy we have in this society. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Of course, electric cars are part of the solution, to climate change, and we need all hands on deck right now, but they're a part of it. And solutions like public transit are actually a really, really important part of it too. And creating places to bike and walk and reclaim our streets are really important parts of it as well. When we have that space on our city streets and give it over to people, we're creating all kinds of solutions at once, not, one of them being how we move through cities safely. And so I think that's really it, that of course, the Infrastructure Act is a really important step, and electrification is a big part of this. But there's a lot in there too about things like nature-based solutions as well, being part of the way that we can respond to global climate change. And there's some really great examples in the book that I highlight that they're really ripe right now, because as I said, often these experiments start small and then grow from there. And what's been happening is that, we've been seeing a lot of these experiments get to the point where they really can grow. And so they can be bolstered by federal funding right now in a way that they couldn't have before. And New York City is one great example in the book where, we often don't think of nature-based solutions in a place like New York, one of the largest and most populated city in the country. But experiments there are underway to restore 1 billion oysters to the New York Harbor estuary. And it started by piloting locations for oyster reefs in places like Soundview Park in the Bronx, where there was just a 1 acre pilot, which showed natural recruitment. And through the Billion Oyster Project, which is a project that brings together scientists and students and volunteers to help to restore oysters in the New York Harbor, they've been able to expand the reef and monitor its success. And the Billion Oyster Project is run from Governor's Island, where public school students at the harbor school are learning to operate boats and to spawn oysters and create reef systems and monitor restoration sites. And today, Soundview is one of the largest restored oyster habitats in the estuary. And so, the lessons learned there have informed other pilot projects, including near the former Tappan Zee Bridge, where oysters are now thriving. And oysters are part of the living breakwaters for Staten Island, which is being built by landscape architects to buffer, the storms ahead. So today, the Billion Oyster Project is currently the nursery for more than 30 oysteration projects in the harbor. So, I think from whether we're talking about reclaiming our streets to adapting our shorelines, experimentation done by scientists and urbanists and communities has really been an essential part of creating effective change.
Yeah, and what I appreciate so much is your drive towards equity throughout this work, especially finding those stories that wouldn't naturally get told. Because I find that as someone with a microphone searching for stories out there, it's really easy to find those voices that create noise already, and I can go find that, and they know, oh, I can come onto the show, but really taking the effort to dig deeper and to use those kind of outlets for people that are traditionally or historically have been overlooked. I think that's a tremendous effort that gets highlighted here. And Alison, I guess the last thing that I want to end with is this is so much about a ground up, bottom up solution. How do you think people can really take agency within their home, their family, their lives, so that they can live more with their values of what you're talking about, and they want to feel a sense that they're moving the needle in the right direction?
I think, it's important that we're all a part of making a difference. And, we often think of sort of top-down efforts being the solution to be effective, but this work really does need to start on the ground and be supported and scaled from there. So, I think there's little different scales of what people can do, and what can one person do, an individual. First, the most important is that you can get out of your car and you can ride or walk or take transit and to work or school, even just a few times a week. Believe me, it's addictive and joyful. I love riding my bike. And with, transportation responsible for the majority of US greenhouse gas emissions, you're making an impact. And as I've said, less cars makes room. It makes room for bike lanes. It makes room for safer streets and efficient transit. We can do a lot with our roads when they're free of cars. It's something like 25 to 35% of the space of a city, more than all of the public parks put together. So I look forward to seeing what we do with that space. And I think that too, that as an individual, you can find people and organizations in your community that are making a difference, and you can help them. You can plant a tree or steward a green space. You can volunteer for a few days a month. You can do a lot to connect through those kinds of opportunities to changing the place you live. And I also think that businesses and organizations are a big part of these solutions as well. Many of the projects that we've talked about today, like the Parklet projects, are part of public-private partnerships where, businesses have invested in creating and hosting a parklet. So, small businesses can make a parklet on their street, and it does a lot to improve public space in neighborhoods. And also you can encourage people to bike and walk and take transit to work. You can subsidize bike share membership for your employees. This worked really well in another example that I highlight in the book called in Bed-Stuy, where the neighbors in Bed-Stuy were given affordable ways of participating in bike share, which was the difference between them using the system or not. And some of that came from employers subsidizing those memberships. And then, larger businesses can partner with local advocacy groups and make sure that their employees have time to volunteer for them and help fund their efforts. As I point out throughout the book, inequity is systemic. And I really can't emphasize this enough, that organizations have to make sure that their composition reflects the real diversity of this country so that everyone has economic opportunities and fair pay. And we talked a little bit about national government and federal policies as well. And I think local government is a piece of that. Local governments need to make sure that communities are part of shaping decisions by requiring that community leadership is a part of the development process. In the Bay Area, BCDC has created the Environmental Justice and Social Equity Bay Plan Amendment. And that is an amendment that requires that communities are a part of creating development plans, which has really affected, for example, the creation of shoreline parks in Bayview Hunters Point. And then on a national scale, policy is still really important to driving change quickly. The Clean Water Act, which I mentioned, is a part, is sort of rooted in my personal history in terms of it being inaugurated right around the time I was born. It's still, 50 years later, affecting green infrastructure in cities today. And it's critical that we continue to have those kinds of policies that can affect change. But this work also needs to support communities in driving the change. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act really needs to make sure that the money that's promised through this bill makes it past state budgets and into local projects. We need to encourage the right people to do this work, especially those living in under-resourced communities.
We get a lot of work at all levels. But what a novel approach. Who would have thought that from the ground up would have been the way to go rather than top down? Alison, this has just been a tremendous lot of fun for me. I'm so glad that we got to connect. I'm really appreciative that somebody out there put this work together. And what I love, and I've said this plenty of times for the people that are tuning into the show, is how people put their vocation together, really putting their different experiences, their lived experiences that they processed throughout their lifetimes into productive and creative ways in which they can make an impact in this world. And you are just like, it's so great to go back to really frame where you grew up in DC and the influences that your parents had, to even your undergraduate degree that may seem out of sorts at first from an architectural career, but it makes all the sense. And it's really created something truly hopeful and beautiful to put out to the world that hopefully can inspire a lot more people to take agency and to create the impact, either from planting a tree or to advocacy efforts and activism efforts.
Thank you for your kind words. It's been such a pleasure talking with you, and I love your series, and you've interviewed so many wonderful people. So it's great that you're growing the audience for this kind of work. And thank you for contributing to the field in the way that you are.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the show today. If you want to follow our work at Latitude, you can follow us on Instagram at latitude.regenerative.re, and mine is at I am Neil Collins. We inherently believe in the potential that comes from connecting value-aligned and purpose-driven people together in community. That's why I encourage you to join our mighty network and introduce yourself to the other people working across the globe to advance a more regenerative, resilient, and beautiful world. Here, we want to know what you're working on and what inspires you. Through this platform, you can attend live events, take courses provided by our podcast guests, and create connection with other people and businesses that share your same passion. To join, find the link in our show notes or visit our website at chooselatitude.com. If you'd like to support the show, please share it with your friends and be sure to follow us on your podcast app so that you always have the latest episode downloaded. Another way to support our regenerative field building is to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Positive ratings help attract amazing guests, and they can be the deciding factor for someone else to tune in and listen. And who knows, maybe this is the kind of motivation that it takes for them to finally decide to align their profession with their sustainable and regenerative values and become a positive force for good within their own community. This show was produced by myself and edited by Anthony Wallace and offered as a part of our work with Latitude Regenerative Real Estate.